If I was forced to describe Andro Dunos II in just one word, it would actually be pretty easy to do. The word would be solid. When it comes to the game itself, pretty much every aspect of it is just well done, cleanly and competently implemented, and all round solid. However, despite having heard a lot of rave reviews for it, I do also have to say that I didn't find much that was all too spectacular about the game itself, while the options and extras left really quite a lot to be desired. Like I said, the main game is solid, very solid, but nothing that particularly blew me away. Which is fine, not every new shmup needs to reinvent the wheel, and the fact that Andro Dunos II doesn't even try may, for some people, even be considered one of its greatest strengths. Now, Andro Dunos II has had a slightly odd journey to its 2022 release. The original game, developed by Visco, came out 30 years ago on the Neo Geo, and if, like me, you ever spend time on Twitter or other forums or social media discussing shmups, you will probably have noticed a lot of chat goes on regarding which classic 90s shmup should be revived, remastered, ported, or even the highest honour granted a full-blown sequel. In such discussions, I do not remember the name Andro Dunos being brought up even once. However, be granted a sequel it has, although in a somewhat confusing way, with multiple editions, covers and publishers, and to be honest, I'm not even sure in which regions and on what systems it's currently available, but I have now got my hands on a European physical copy for Switch, and I'm thoroughly glad to be putting all the confusion aside and just getting on with enjoying the game. Not least because it is most definitely an easy one to enjoy. Developer Pickering Soft has taken an unashamedly old school approach with this, very much feeling, looking and sounding like a sequel made about 3 years rather than 30 after the original. And it's a sequel that crucially stays true to its origins while also improving and expanding on its predecessor's base formula. That base formula was, as you can see, a horizontal scrolling shmup, and the key mechanics on offer is the option to rotate through 4 weapon types, with all of these being available right from the start. The default controls see you cycle through the options either forwards or backwards using the right and left shoulder buttons, which works perfectly well with a control pad or in handheld mode, but as we will see later is far less ideal when playing with an arcade stick. The 4 weapons each have their strengths and weaknesses and do need to be switched between in certain situations. But these strengths are not always immediately apparent, since each can also be leveled up individually, either by collecting power-ups during play or by using bonus points collected at stage end. The green laser, for example, seemed to me not to have much going for it at first, until I found out that leveling it up to max turns it into a multi-directional powerhouse. Each weapon also has a second, more powerful function, and the way this works is probably the game's most interesting point. You can fire the second shot at almost any time to either cause huge damage or cover the screen with fire depending on weapon chosen. However, after the shot runs its course, it's placed onto a cooldown before you can use it again. The cooldown is not too long, but during its initial stages your primary weapon returns to its base level, meaning choosing when to deploy your special attacks requires a fair bit of thought to achieve optimal effect. This is a good, fun, and, to really hammer home the point, solid system. It doesn't offer anything particularly new or terribly intricate, but it makes for a good, easy to get into system that's neither so simple as to be boring, nor so complex as to be off-putting. There are also further missile and shield pickups that can be collected, with missiles firing alongside your primary shot, and shields positioning themselves differently depending on weapon selected. You may also have noticed the blue orbs floating around, and these are effectively the game's scoring system. Each small orb is worth 1 and each large one 5. There are a total of 30 to be collected per stage, and for every 10 you collect, on top of the bonus points, you are granted an extra credit to use on leveling up your weapons, missiles and shields, or even if you're feeling confident, to just further boost your score. This allows you to concentrate on leveling up 1 or 2 weapons during a stage, while still being able to bring the weaker ones up to speed for later use, and is a nice little system, although its leveling up purpose does exceed its merit as a scoring mechanic, which is relatively limited. Visually, the game gets yet another very solid from me. The enemies are nice and chunky, and the backgrounds manage to capture that old school feel while traversing a variety of locations, with multiple scrolling elements giving many of the stages a nice feeling of depth. Bosses are big, bad and varied, ranging from classic turreted machines on tracks to robotic fish, and as well as appearing at stage end, can be faced all in a row in the game's boss rush mode, which is an extra unlocked after beating the game's main stages, of which there are 7. Music is perhaps the one area where I would say the game steps beyond that solid description and deserves some higher praise. It didn't really strike me that hard at first, but the longer I played, the more I came to enjoy it. And again, similarly to the visuals, it does a great job of replicating that old school atmosphere, dredging up nostalgic feelings, which is impressive considering it's not really possible to feel nostalgia for a game you just picked up last week. Now, with all that said, there are a few issues that start to appear when we look outside the simple core game experience, and it's these that have really led to me being confused by some of the reception this game has received, as while a lot of game criticism is obviously based on individual preferences, there are certain things that are just objectively good or bad to either have or not have, and Andro Dunos II has a lot of what I would say are unequivocal flaws, some of them relatively major. First up are good things it lacks. The most obvious is online leaderboards. Now, I'm aware this is probably something not that easy for smaller indie studios to implement, but regardless, they're not there, and that's a minus one. However, what really exacerbates this issue is that the game carries your score on when you continue, rendering even the local leaderboards all but useless. Of course, as mentioned, scoring isn't that big a thing in the game anyway, so if we put all this together, it means we can basically say score play is almost non-existent here. A big lack for a shmup. Also missing are options of just about any sort. When you pause the game, the only thing you can do is quit. There's literally nothing else. And even in the main menus, there's very little. No visual options or ability to change the background, just some very limited control options that are particularly unfit for purpose if you're using an arcade stick, since on a standard setup they leave you with firing using the bottom left buttons and shot selection using the top right buttons, a really awkward setup that leaves you basically restricted to cycling through weapons one way only, and even that not being optimal. And it's not just things that are missing. The game's extra content is also implemented in a way that leaves a lot to be desired. As mentioned, beating the game unlocks a boss rush mode, and this appears in the game's stage select menu. But there are 2 further slots beyond that which I currently have not managed to unlock. I know what they are, which is 2 further retro stages, and I know how to get them, which is by beating the boss rush mode. However, I have so far been unable to do that. Now, I am not some highly skilled player and would never claim to be, but we have online leaderboards these days, and I do know roughly where I usually place. So I would estimate that if I am not able to unlock these stages, they're probably also going to remain inaccessible for a large number of non-expert players, as evidenced by how infrequently you'll have seen them mentioned in reviews of the game. And 2 extra stages in a 7-stage shmup. That is a huge chunk of content that the majority of people are unlikely to ever actually experience, which seems a waste for both the players and of the time the developer must have spent creating them. Now, I don't want to make excuses, so I will be clear, the primary reason I have not unlocked them yet is simply because I haven't got good enough. However, there are also a couple of secondary reasons that have made me less willing to make the effort than usual. One is that I don't know how many bosses there are in the boss rush mode. I can make it to the 6th boss most times now, but whether you then just face off against one more standard boss, or have to go through the whole sequence of final stage transformations, I don't know, and this makes me less inclined to keep going since I have no idea quite how feasible completion is for me. Secondly, there are huge gaps, often nearly 20 seconds long, between each boss, during which you just float along doing nothing until the next boss appears, often with their own little intro animation. In the main game this is fine, it's a nice little breather, but when you're just repeating this dead space over and over and over as happens in the boss rush, it can become really annoying. Now, I'm aware those are a lot of negatives, but as you'll have noticed, none of them, other than the arcade stick controls, really affect the main game itself, which remains, as I said at the top, a perfectly solid and enjoyable shmup. In other words, Andro Dunos II is a good game. It's a fun game, and it's one that I would recommend. But it's also one whose limitations are, as far as I'm concerned, absolutely impossible to either deny or ignore, and I would give it a 7 out of 10 overall. As I mentioned, I've seen the game garner a lot of very positive attention, so I will be very interested to hear everyone's thoughts in the comments if you too have played it. As ever, thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Cheers.